Cool. So, David, thank you for taking time out. We're obviously here to have a chat about the ritual. I think
Sure.
looking through your previous work, there seems to be all of them seem to have some sort of basis of real life or truth. They've all kind of been based on something that, is tangible. What is it about, those stories that is so important for you to tell?
Um, I think that true stories have always fascinated me, partially because I think the way my mind works in developing a story, developing a film, a screenplay, and then, turning the screenplay into an actual film. For some reason, it it I like having sort of an established set of facts that we know are facts, things that actually happened, that are documented, that are in the archive, and then sort of building, filling in the gaps, imagining, well, if this happened on this day and 2 days later this happened, what must have happened in that intervening day, in the day in between, and kind of taking educated guesses about, filling in those gaps. And I kind of approach it like a journalist does. And I think that the one of the things that I've always felt like the films that I've made have in common is they all, in their own ways, ask questions about how how people treat the most vulnerable people among them. Whether it's my first feature film was about a brother and a sister with or a sister and her brother with autism as they sort of navigate through the world together. And then I made a film that asked some questions about how people with mental health challenges, people of color, people in low income communities are treated by law enforcement, in America at least. And then, this film, even though it's a genre film and it's in that sort of horror vein, I still sort of viewed the film at its heart, you know, about a group of people who came together and put themselves at great personal risk in order to help alleviate the suffering that this poor woman was experiencing. So I think that those are kind of some of the things that I always feel like those are the stories that I'm attracted to.
Hmm. And the story in question, is said to be, the one that inspired the novel of The Exorcist. Given the legacy of that novel and that film, how daunting was it to kind of go back to that source material?
I mean, it was a big, big responsibility, and The Exorcist. I will never ever forget the first time I saw it. It's one of those, seeing that film for the first time was one of those um, transformative childhood experiences of seeing a film that, had such an impact on my central nervous system that even when I watch that film today, I get the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, and it's just one of my absolute favorite films. Despite the fact that I didn't grow up Catholic, I was raised in a Jewish household, um, but there was just something about that film that really, really had an impact on me. And when you're telling any true story, it's obviously there's obviously a lot of responsibility that's associated with it, but especially a film that is as beloved as The Exorcist. And one of the things that we tried to do was really go back to the source material, for this case, operating from that established set of facts. And um, it's impossible to know exactly what was in William Peter Blatty, the author's mind. It was possible to know exactly what was in his mind, but it seems as though he really did his homework. He was inspired by some of the most iconic stories and cases of supposed demonic possession and exorcism in history, one of which was this case.
Yeah. And thanks to the popularity of The Exorcist, there have been hundreds of films that explore faith and demonic possession. Obviously you've mentioned The Exorcist, but what are, some of your other favorites? And did any of them inform your approach either to the story or the scares?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the biggest challenges with this film. I think we wanted to we wanted to pay homage to some of the films that deal with possession and exorcism that we really love, but we also obviously wanted to differentiate ourselves and put our own kind of stamp on it. So balancing those two things was definitely an exciting challenge to take on. And I mean, there's a lot of great ones. There's a lot of, possession and exorcism films that I really love that explore different aspects of the conversation between science and faith, and can those two things coexist, and what how do those two things relate to each other in this story are is you know, the afflicted individual in our case, was she suffering from mental health challenges? Was this something spiritual, or was it both? You know, was an interesting question for us to ask, and we definitely took a lot of cues from some of our favorite horror and exorcism films, but also definitely tried to put our own stamp on it.
Mm. I kind of feel that one of the ways that you've done that is, a lot of time, possession stories kind of hone in on the priests, which obviously the ritual does to a degree, but there's also a lot of feminine presence and energy in this film. There's the heavy inclusion of the nuns. What do you think that their addition brings to the piece?
I mean, I think in many ways this is a female centric story, because the afflicted individual is a female, and the this event actually happened in a convent in a small town in Iowa, and the sisters and the mother superior who were in that convent obviously had to make great sacrifices, and put themselves at a great deal of spiritual risk and physical risk, and emotional risk to try to help this woman. They were basically inviting, a version of the devil into their home under the same roof where they slept, where they ate, where they lived their lives. So, one of the things that I really thought a lot about is um how terrifying that must have been, what a huge responsibility they must have felt to try to help this woman to take on a task like this, to invite, a woman who was supposedly possessed by demons under their own roof. So I think that, that was a really important aspect of the story for me, was to have, you know, nuanced nuanced female characters that you could see were making a great sacrifice, and were had to summon up a lot of bravery and courage to put themselves at risk in this way, and to invite someone like this into their home.
I think it's also interesting how, the film does kind of shift in perspective. It does spend time with the nuns, it does spend time with the priests. We do see some of the, the afflicted person as well. Whereas I think so often other films decide, right, we're going with the possessed person, we're going to tell the story from their point of view, or we're
Right.
telling it from the point of view of, these people investigating. So, I mean, was that struggle kind of like juggling all those different point of views? Because I mean, a lot of the film, the way it's shot, it does feel very documentary, the way that the camera moves and stuff. Was it that kind of prompted that kind of like, let's focus on everybody?
Uh, to an extent, I think it did. I think it, what I remember from the development process was that each subsequent draft of the script became more and more of an ensemble piece, because we were finding all these really fascinating. I was like, oh, how we have to get this detail of what this sister experienced at some point in here, and we have to, like, what must it have been like for the mother superior to be overseeing this, and we wanted to sort of do justice to all of those characters and what they were going through. And one of the hardest things about making a film is having to cut scenes that you absolutely love, because if you have to keep the film at a certain runtime, you have to excise some of your favorite scenes sometimes. And we had some really, really phenomenal scenes with the sisters and with Mother Superior that really you know went deep into what their experience was like. And we still have a lot of that in the film, but there was even more that ended up on the cutting room floor that I'm really hoping, maybe on a DVD release or something like that, we'll be able to show people the incredible work that some of these actresses did that ended up on the cutting room floor, as well as, obviously Dan Stevens and Al Pacino. Everybody's roles, as with any film, you have to excise certain scenes from all the characters' perspectives.
Mm. I mean, we do have to sort of touch upon because, firstly, Al Pacino, an acting institution, how was he to work with, or what, this is still quite early on in your feature directing career, and suddenly you've got Al Pacino on your set.
It was an incredible experience. Al never treated me or anyone else on set like anything less than an equal. He was gracious and respectful and positive and enthusiastic and collaborative the entire time. I really can't say enough positive things about, working with Al and then just Al as a human being in general. It was really an incredible experience. I remember the very first meeting that we had together was just me and him. And I was obviously very nervous going into the meeting. I hadn't met him before. Um, but within probably 10 or 15 minutes of us sitting at the table, it just became two artists talking about characters in the story. All of that kind of fear and worry faded away because he's just, Al himself is so disarming and personable and doesn't treat anyone like anything less than an equal.
That's interesting as well. Obviously, he was the devil in The Devil's
Right.
Advocate, and now he is fighting the devil. It's quite an interesting juxtaposition for his career. If like 30 years later, and he's on the opposite side of the playing field.
That's right. He's kind of spanned the entire spectrum. That's true.
And Dan Stevens, I think last year in cinema, he seemed to be the actor that was having the most fun. Like all of his characters in Godzilla
Right.
X Kong, Cuckoo, Abigail, he was just having a whale of a time. He's having a much more stressful time in The Ritual. What was it
Yes.
about him that made you know that he had the power that was needed for this role? That he could kind of access those darker areas that his character has to go to.
It's funny because Dan is really in many ways he is so brilliant when he plays some of those more charactery type supporting roles like he did in obviously Abigail and Cuckoo and films like that, which that came out last year. But obviously this is really more of a kind of the avatar for the audience. He and the sisters really are the ones who the audience is seeing what's unfolding from their perspective. And it was really amazing the way he guided the audience through that process. You can see everything written across his face. He's got a lot of scenes in this film, as you know. He has scenes in this film where he's more or less an observer who's kind of supposed to be overseeing and supposed to be taking, notating down what's happening. That was the story and the documentation on this case were developed from the notes that Father Steiger took on what was happening. Um, so it was really important that we had an actor who was capable of bringing the audience in without dialogue. Being able to see on the actor's face what's happening. He's watching Emma over here, he's watching Father Theophilus next to her, and then all of a sudden a table falls over in the corner of the room. And how does he react to that? How do other people react to that? So I think Dan's the variety of experiences that Dan has had and the variety of roles that he's taken on, I think have really proven him to be um one of the most versatile actors out there. He can clearly play this type of avatar for the audience, the leading man role, but he obviously loves sinking his teeth into those really fun character parts. And there's not as much of that in this film. Obviously, his character is very stressed here, not having as much fun.
Yeah, but he's a fascinating character as well because he's a man of God, but he's also not. He's a man of God that embraces science to a degree. He's not one of the, there is that trope, particularly in this sort of story, where, they're either a devout Christian or they're having an absolute crisis of faith. But here, he has his beliefs, but he's not gonna neglect facts and science, and medicine in the process
Right.
either.
Yeah, and a lot of that came from the research that we had done on, Father Theophilus and Father Steiger came from very different worlds. Father Theophilus obviously was German, raised in Bavaria, and he was a Capuchin friar, um, which the experience and the daily lives of Capuchin friars is very different from a parish priest like Father Steiger is. Father Steiger was also younger, probably had some more modern training than Father Theophilus did because Father Theophilus was quite a bit older. So, that was an interesting juxtaposition that we tried to show with these characters that, you know, um, Father Theophilus is really all along throughout the story the true believer. He has seen it before, he has experienced it before, and that's the perspective that he comes to this situation with. Whereas Father Steiger doesn't have experience with supposed possession or exorcism. He is a parish priest in the community. He's younger, probably has some more modern training, may have taken some psychology classes, those kinds of things.
Yeah, so it's a fascinating sort of, direction and juxtaposition of everything that's going on. And I guess sort of, my final question, to you is, why do you hope that the audiences take a chance on the ritual? Like I say, there's been a lot of films dealing with, exorcism and demonic possessions, but I do think that this film does have something different. What do you hope that the audience get out of this film?
So many things. Aside from the fact that we have just the most incredible cast in the world who all put every ounce of their blood, sweat, and tears and heart and soul into this film. We attempted to do something here that is different than so many other exorcism films because we did everything we could to keep the story as grounded as possible. These were real human beings who experienced this. Whether you believe whether you believe what happened was related to psychological issues, or you believe what happened was related to spiritual issues, or a mixture of both. What you can't deny is that these were real human beings who actually existed, who actually experienced a great deal of suffering. And these, as we discussed earlier, the sisters and the Mother Superior, and even Father Steiger and Father Theophilus had to put themselves at great personal, physical, spiritual, psychological risk. And they had to summon up a lot of bravery and courage to accomplish this task. So I think the human element and the responsibility that we felt to do justice to these real people is really what I hope audiences take away from it. And I think that really differentiates this story from a lot of the other films out there, some of which are great. But I think that's the primary aspect that differentiates this story.
And it also kind of gives the audience a nice opportunity for some homework as well. Once you've kind of watched it, you can
Yeah.
then sort of go in and dig into, that history and, those records and sort of see, even more than what the film can cover, what their experience was.
Absolutely. That's one of my favorite things about watching true story films is you can every time I watch a film that's based on a true story, I spend a couple hours that night going down a Google rabbit hole of like, oh, that's interesting. This person did this and this was actually true. And that's one of my favorite things about those types of films. So absolutely that they'll have their homework to do.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me and best of luck with the film.
Of course, thank you very much. I appreciate it.